October 1944. The dense forests of northern France. A German panzer crew waits tensely, their fingers gripped tightly around the controls of their mighty Tiger tanks. The roar of engines vibrates through the cold air as they maneuver carefully through the underbrush, expecting the usual skirmish with Allied infantry. In their minds, these tanks are impenetrable fortresses, their thick armor capable of shrugging off almost any weapon the Allies could throw at them. The crew feels invincible, confident in the power of their machine, until the silence is broken by the unmistakable sound of American infantry moving in. Out of nowhere, the first rocket strikes the side of their tank with a deafening explosion. The crew is stunned, disoriented. The tank shudders, but they expect it to be just another close call. Then another, and another. Each blast, louder and more terrifying than the last, sends shockwaves through their vehicle. It is impossible. The tank's armor, once thought invulnerable, is being pierced with terrifying ease. The Germans' worst fear comes to life before their eyes. The Americans, with a simple weapon they had never fully feared, are dismantling their once unstoppable machines. The U.S. bazooka, a weapon the Germans had underestimated, has turned the tide of the battle. For the first time in this war, the mighty German tank is not a symbol of invincibility, but one of vulnerability. The tank crews can hardly believe what is happening as their armor gives way to the explosive power of the bazooka, and they realize too late that they are not fighting an equal enemy. They are fighting one with the power to pierce their mightiest defense. By 1944, the Allies had made significant advancements on the Western Front, following the success of the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944. The relentless push across France and into Germany was beginning to stretch the German defenses thinner and thinner. The German military, once confident in its seemingly invincible defenses, was now facing a crisis on multiple fronts, and one of its primary assets, the fearsome German tanks, was about to meet its match. The German tanks, particularly the Tiger and Panther models, were considered some of the most advanced armored vehicles of World War II. Their thick armor, heavy firepower, and impressive design made them formidable adversaries on the battlefield. The Germans had built these tanks to dominate, and they had been very successful at doing so, particularly in the early stages of the war. With a powerful 80mm gun, the Tiger tank was capable of destroying almost any enemy vehicle it encountered, while its thick armor made it nearly impervious to most Allied weapons. However, by 1944, the Allies had caught up. They had learned from previous engagements with German armor and developed new tactics and weapons to counter it. The most notable of these weapons was the U.S. bazooka, a portable anti-tank rocket launcher that was proving to be a game-changer. Originally developed in the early years of the war, the bazooka had undergone numerous modifications and improvements, making it more effective and more powerful as time went on. Despite its relatively simple design, the bazooka could now pierce the armor of German tanks with startling efficiency. The bazooka's success came at a time when the Germans were increasingly relying on their armored vehicles to stop the Allies' advancing forces. The Allied forces, including the Americans, had to find a way to neutralize the German tanks in order to maintain their momentum. The U.S. Army, which had experienced its share of setbacks against the formidable German armor, now saw the bazooka as a critical tool in its arsenal. It was a weapon that could be used by infantry squads, giving them the ability to destroy tanks from a distance. As the Allies advanced into occupied France and Germany, they encountered German tanks at every turn. But now, thanks to the bazooka, they had the means to take them down. The Germans, on the other hand, had grown accustomed to their tanks' dominance. The success of their armored forces had been a cornerstone of their early victories in the war, and the sight of the Allies, particularly the Americans, using a simple, portable weapon to destroy their tanks was not only surprising, it was humiliating. German officers, who had once believed their tanks were impenetrable fortresses, now had to face the harsh reality that they could be easily destroyed by an enemy they had underestimated. In the forests of northern France, as the Allies pushed forward, German tank crews were put to the ultimate test. They had grown accustomed to relying on their tanks' superiority to engage the enemy, but with the Allies' use of bazookas, that superiority was called into question. The bazooka was able to pierce the heavy armor of the Tiger and Panther tanks, rendering them vulnerable in a way that had not been anticipated. As the Allied infantry pressed their attack, German tank crews were forced to reckon with the fact that their tanks, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, were now vulnerable to a weapon they had never fully respected. Germans had not only underestimated the bazooka, but had also miscalculated the speed at which the Allies would adapt and counter their own strategies. The bazooka, once considered a secondary weapon by the Germans, was now a primary tool used to halt the German advance and clear the way for Allied forces. The once feared Tiger tank, which had been the cornerstone of Germany's armored forces, was now being systematically destroyed by a simple weapon that could be carried by individual soldiers. The emotional and psychological impact of this realization on the German tank crews was profound. They had come to see their tanks as invincible, and the reality of their vulnerability was a devastating blow. For the German tank crews, who had long been the elite of the Wehrmacht, the sight of their tanks being easily destroyed by American infantrymen wielding the bazooka was a deeply shocking and demoralizing experience. These men had spent years honing their craft, learning how to command some of the most advanced and deadly tanks in the world. The Tiger and Panther tanks, with their superior firepower and thick armor, had been the backbone of the German offensive strategy. The crews, trained to trust in the invulnerability of their vehicles, had been led to believe that no weapon on the battlefield could penetrate their tank's armor. But in the face of the bazooka, everything changed. The German tank crews were confronted with a new reality. Their tanks, once considered invincible, were now vulnerable to a weapon that was relatively simple, portable, and carried by infantrymen who could strike from unexpected positions. The emotional toll this realization had on the German tank crews was immense. The pilots, who had grown accustomed to overwhelming Allied forces with their firepower and armor, were now faced with the prospect of being outgunned by a weapon they had initially dismissed as inadequate. The psychological impact of this shift in power was immediate. German tank crews, once confident in their ability to dominate the battlefield, now found themselves fearful of being ambushed by American infantry. The Germans had always viewed their tanks as the ultimate weapon, and to be outwitted and outmaneuvered by infantrymen carrying a rocket launcher was a devastating blow to their morale. The emotional toll was especially high for the seasoned veterans who had fought in some of the most brutal engagements on the eastern and western fronts. These men had seen the tide of war begin to turn against them, but the bazooka's effectiveness represented a level of vulnerability they had never anticipated. The shock was compounded by the fact that the Germans were not just losing their tanks, they were losing their sense of superiority. The very thing that had made them feared in Europe, their armored divisions, was now being systematically destroyed by a weapon that, on paper, should have been no match for the mighty Tiger tank. For the German soldiers, who had long believed that their tanks could dominate any battlefield, the reality of their vulnerability became a painful and profound moment of reckoning. The arrival of the U.S. bazooka on the battlefield in 1942 signaled a fundamental shift in anti-tank warfare. Prior to the war, tanks were largely considered invulnerable to most infantry weapons, and tanks had dominated the battlefield, giving armies with superior armored vehicles a distinct advantage. However, the development and deployment of the bazooka, an effective, portable anti-tank weapon, redefined the way infantry could engage tanks and dramatically altered the tactics on both sides. The bazooka's success came from its simplicity and ease of use. Unlike larger, more complicated anti-tank guns, which required heavy artillery and specialized training, The bazooka could be operated by regular infantrymen. Its portability meant that it could be carried into battle by soldiers who were not part of specialized anti-tank units, making it an easily deployable weapon in urban, forested, or other difficult terrains. This gave the Allies the ability to engage German tanks in ways that had never been possible before. The fact that a single infantryman could destroy a German tank with a few well-placed shots was a game-changer on the battlefield. The tactical implications of the bazooka's effectiveness were enormous. The German tanks, which had been used to spearhead attacks and provide formidable defense, were now vulnerable to a weapon that could be employed by small infantry squads. German tank commanders were forced to change their tactics, retreating from frontline positions and moving in smaller formations to avoid being targeted by the bazooka. The need for constant support and protection from infantry, as well as increased caution in tank deployment, was a direct result of the bazooka's success. The bazooka also shifted the balance of power in battles between infantry and armor. In previous engagements, infantrymen would often have little hope of stopping an advancing tank force. Now, with the bazooka, they had a tool that could give them the upper hand. This shift in tactics was crucial to the success of the Allied forces, as it allowed infantry to support tank-busting operations and created new opportunities for combined arms warfare. The Allies could now coordinate more effectively with infantry, bombers, and fighters to destroy tanks on the move and disrupt German armored units more easily. For the Germans, the appearance of the bazooka represented a new kind of threat, one that they were ill-prepared to deal with. They had relied heavily on the power of their tanks, and the effectiveness of the bazooka was a stark reminder that their perceived superiority could be undermined by new tactics and technologies. The tactical shift that the bazooka heralded put additional pressure on German tank units, forcing them into a defensive posture they were not accustomed to. German commanders had to adjust their strategies, incorporating more infantry support and changing their tank formations to protect against the new threat posed by bazooka-equipped infantry. The success of the bazooka also accelerated the development of similar anti-tank weapons on both sides. As the Allies refined their anti-tank capabilities, the Germans began to adapt, developing their own handheld anti-tank weapons such as the Panzerfaust and the Panzerschreck. These weapons, however, came too late in the war to have a significant impact on the battlefield. The Allies, with their technological advantage, had already turned the tide of battle in the favor of their infantry, and the Germans were increasingly unable to keep up. The pivotal moment came in the intense battles that raged across Europe in 1944 and 1945, particularly during the Allied push through France and into Germany. As the Allies gained ground, they encountered ever more formidable German tank forces, including the feared Tiger II tanks, massive, heavily armored machines designed to withstand almost any enemy attack. The German tank divisions, which had once been considered the pinnacle of military might, were now tasked with stopping the advancing Allied forces. However, they found themselves facing a new kind of threat: U.S. infantry armed with bazookas. The turning point came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when a fierce German counteroffensive aimed to drive the Allies back. The German tanks, led by the powerful Tiger II and Panther tanks, sought to crush the advancing American forces. But despite their superior armor and firepower, the German tanks were met with the deadly force of the bazooka. As American infantrymen emerged from the forests of Belgium, they used the bazookas to disable the German tanks from ranges once thought impossible. The powerful blast of the bazooka tore through the thick armor of the German tanks, sending shockwaves of disbelief through the German tank crews. The moment when the German tank crews realized that their tanks, once considered nearly impervious to most infantry weapons, could be easily destroyed by a weapon as simple as the bazooka, marked the end of their dominance on the battlefield. The Tigers and Panthers, which had struck fear into the hearts of the Allies just a year earlier, were now vulnerable to a weapon they had not fully understood or respected. The realization was nothing short of devastating. German tank commanders had long relied on the invulnerability of their armor, but now they found themselves in a desperate fight, unable to counter the bazooka's deadly accuracy. The U.S. infantry, once seen as vulnerable to German tanks, now became the attackers, using the bazookas to cripple and destroy the very machines that had terrorized the battlefield for years. The psychological impact on the German tank crews was immense. These soldiers, who had been trained to rely on their tanks as the ultimate weapon of war, were now faced with the stark reality that their once unbeatable tanks could be easily knocked out by a single well-placed shot from an infantryman. The realization shattered the myth of German tank invincibility, and the Allies now had a decisive advantage. The breakthrough in this moment of combat wasn't just technological, it was psychological. The Germans, who had been so confident in their military superiority, were now forced to confront a new kind of warfare. The Allies were no longer just fighting their tanks with firepower. They were using new tactics and weapons that undermined the German forces' entire approach to armored warfare. The Germans, relying heavily on their tanks for both offense and defense, were now realizing that the key to defeating them wasn't just about outgunning them, but about finding ways to use ingenuity and new technology to counter their strength. This moment in the Battle of the Bulge would serve as a microcosm of the larger shift that occurred in World War II. The once dominant German tanks were now vulnerable to a force they had underestimated: the American infantry armed with bazookas. This moment of reckoning represented the ultimate triumph of Allied innovation and adaptability. The Germans had once believed that their tanks, capable of withstanding most attacks, would give them the upper hand. But in the face of new weaponry, including the bazooka, their tanks were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. As the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the sheer scale of the change in the battlefield dynamics became evident. The German tank divisions, which had once been the spearhead of Nazi military strategy, were now under direct threat from the very infantry they had once easily crushed. The realization that their mighty armored vehicles, such as the Tiger and Panther tanks, could be destroyed by a simple anti-tank rocket launcher was an unimaginable shift for the Germans. The effectiveness of the bazooka in piercing the thick armor of their tanks was a devastating blow, and it quickly became apparent that the war on the ground had irrevocably changed. What made the bazooka so effective wasn't just its power. It was its accessibility and the speed with which it could be used. American infantry, now armed with these relatively light but powerful weapons, were able to destroy German tanks in close-quarters combat, often while the tanks themselves were unprepared for the attack. No longer were Allied soldiers helpless against the formidable German tank formations. The sudden vulnerability of the German tanks on the battlefield shattered the psychological edge the Germans had held for so long. The moment the German crews realized they were no longer fighting an equal adversary, but one armed with a tool that could neutralize their pride and joy, their morale began to crumble. For the Americans, the power shift was nothing short of revolutionary. They had, for much of the war, faced the immense challenge of combating German tanks that seemed impervious to their weapons. The Allies had relied on tank warfare, bombers, and artillery to break through German defenses, but the introduction of the bazooka marked a significant evolution in infantry combat. The bazooka allowed soldiers to fight back against what had previously been an overwhelming threat. It was now possible to neutralize the seemingly unstoppable German tanks without needing heavy artillery or airstrikes. This was a massive tactical advantage, especially in the dense terrain of the Ardennes forest, where the Allies were fighting the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge. The tight spaces left little room for maneuvering large tanks, and the bazooka-wielding infantry could strike from hidden positions, catching the Germans by surprise. The turning point was not just about the success of the bazooka, but about the broader strategic shift it represented. The Allies had learned from their encounters with German armor and had adapted to counter it. The use of the bazooka was part of a larger movement where infantry tactics and technology worked in unison to overcome the Germans' armored superiority. This moment was a direct challenge to the German doctrine of blitzkrieg, fast-moving tank assaults that overwhelmed the enemy. The U.S. infantry, with their newfound ability to stop the German tanks in their tracks, had effectively neutralized one of the primary components of the Nazi war machine. The emotional response from the German tank crews as they faced this new reality was one of disbelief. They had been trained to view their tanks as the ultimate weapon on the battlefield, the epitome of military power. To be taken down by a single shot from a soldier armed with a handheld weapon was not just a tactical failure, it was a psychological collapse. The realization that their tanks, which had once been the terror of the Allies, were now vulnerable to the infantry that had once been easy targets, was a profound moment of reckoning for the Germans. For the Germans, the outcome of these battles was not only determined by the physical destruction of their tanks, but also by the profound impact on their morale. In the early years of the war, German tanks had been a symbol of strength and efficiency. But as the Allies, especially the Americans, began to adapt, and their infantry started to destroy these tanks with relative ease, the Germans could no longer maintain the illusion of invincibility. What was once their greatest strength had now become their greatest weakness, and the impact of this shift would be felt in every subsequent engagement. The psychological toll on the German military leadership was also significant. They had invested heavily in their tanks, believing them to be the key to victory. But the emergence of the bazooka as a weapon capable of neutralizing these tanks not only changed the way battles were fought, it changed the way the Germans viewed their ability to win the war. As the Allies adapted and found new ways to counter the German threat, the Germans were left scrambling, unable to match the innovations of their enemies. The use of the bazooka was a key moment in this technological arms race, signaling that the Allies had found a way to level the playing field. In the weeks and months following the realization that German tanks could be easily destroyed by the U.S. bazooka, the impact on the battlefield was profound. As the Allies continued their push through France, Belgium, and into Germany, the German tank divisions began to feel the weight of their vulnerability. The once formidable strength of the Tiger and Panther tanks, once considered nearly invincible, was now being systematically neutralized by infantry squads armed with bazookas. The psychological impact on German tank crews was immense as they faced the growing realization that they could no longer rely on their tanks as the ultimate weapon of war. For the German military leadership, the failure to adapt to the effectiveness of the bazooka was a critical error. The Germans had long relied on their tanks as the spearhead of their offensive operations, but the success of the bazooka fundamentally altered this equation. The ability of American infantry to destroy these tanks with relative ease meant that the Germans could no longer count on their armored divisions to provide the same level of defense or offensive power. This shift in battlefield tactics severely crippled the Wehrmacht's ability to wage war. The loss of tank superiority also affected German morale on a broader scale. The once proud divisions of the Wehrmacht, which had been the backbone of the Nazi war machine, were now reduced to ineffective and vulnerable units. For the soldiers who had once been confident in their tanks' invincibility, the shock of seeing them destroyed by a simple portable weapon was a crushing blow. The loss of air superiority, coupled with the growing effectiveness of Allied infantry tactics, left the Germans on the defensive in nearly every engagement. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army's use of the bazooka represented a shift in the nature of infantry warfare. American infantry, once seen as vulnerable to the might of German tanks, now had the power to directly challenge these armored giants. The success of the bazooka allowed U.S. forces to take a more aggressive approach to fighting German tanks, enabling them to launch surprise attacks and destroy tank formations that had previously been seen as nearly invincible. The Allied ability to neutralize German tanks gave them a significant advantage in the field and contributed to their overall strategic success in the European theater. The success of the bazooka also had a broader impact on the development of military technology in the post-war years. The rise of portable anti-tank weapons, such as the bazooka, demonstrated the importance of creating lightweight, easily deployable weapons that could give infantry a fighting chance against armored vehicles. In the years following World War II, this concept would continue to evolve, with new generations of anti-tank weapons being developed to meet the challenges posed by modern warfare. The success of the bazooka also signaled the growing importance of infantry in combined arms operations, where technology could level the playing field between infantry and armored units. The loss of German tank superiority also marked a significant change in the dynamics of the European theater. As the Allies gained the upper hand in tank warfare, they were able to push deeper into German territory. The psychological blow dealt by the bazooka, along with the growing effectiveness of the Allied air forces and artillery, left the German military on the defensive, unable to mount effective counterattacks. By the time the Allies reached the Rhine in early 1945, the German army was effectively broken, and the fight for survival had become a matter of holding off the inevitable. The psychological impact on the German civilians, too, was substantial. The destruction of German tanks by American infantrymen underscored the vulnerability of the Nazi regime. The tanks, which had been a symbol of German power and military pride, were now being destroyed by soldiers who were once considered less powerful and less significant in the eyes of the Nazi propaganda machine. The disillusionment spread across the civilian population, many of whom had been led to believe in the invincibility of the German war machine. As the Allies continued their advance, the hope for victory that had once sustained the civilian population was slowly replaced with the realization that the war was lost. For the Allies, the success of the bazooka and the subsequent damage done to German tank formations contributed to the momentum of the final offensive in Europe. With German tanks neutralized, the Allies could focus on pushing forward, liberating occupied territories, and preparing for the final assault on Berlin. The ability to destroy German armor, once the central element of their military strength, allowed the Allies to advance without fear of encountering the same level of resistance that had stalled them in the past. The bazooka had, in effect, opened the door for the Allies to drive the final nail into the coffin of Nazi Germany's military power. As the war drew closer to its final stages in 1945, the use of the bazooka to neutralize German tanks became emblematic of a broader shift in how the Allies fought the war and how the Germans faced defeat. The psychological, tactical, and material losses the Germans suffered were irreversible. The failure to maintain superiority in armored warfare, which had been one of the cornerstones of their military strategy, marked the collapse of their defenses on the Western Front. By the time the Allies advanced into Germany, the German military had been reduced to a defensive posture, unable to mount any meaningful counteroffensive against the relentless advance of the U.S. Army and its allies. In the immediate aftermath of these successful tank-killing tactics, the German tank divisions that had once been feared across Europe began to disband or were forced to retreat. The elite tank crews, once considered the pride of the Wehrmacht, were now faced with mounting casualties, lost equipment, and no clear path to victory. The Germans had no answer to the bazooka's power. Its ability to disable even the most well-armored vehicles with relative ease had completely altered the battlefield dynamics. As more and more tanks were destroyed by the Allies' infantry, the Germans found themselves without a key element of their military power. Tank production lines were also hit hard by Allied bombing raids, further limiting the Germans' ability to replace the massive losses they had suffered. For the U.S. infantry, the introduction and success of the bazooka had a profound impact. Once considered a secondary weapon in the overall strategy of Allied warfare, the bazooka became an essential tool for infantrymen to combat the heavily armored tanks that were at the heart of the German military's strength. The Allies' ability to take down tanks with minimal support, often by a single soldier armed with a bazooka, was a game-changer in infantry tactics. This newfound ability to fight and win against German armor empowered Allied forces and gave infantry units the confidence to engage German tank divisions head-on. The tactical advantage of the bazooka allowed American forces to act with more autonomy, relying on their own infantry to handle what was once considered an almost insurmountable obstacle. The success of the bazooka also inspired the development of additional anti-tank weapons that would later shape post-war military doctrine. As the war in Europe came to a close, the Allies began to refine and innovate new tools for destroying tanks. The principles of bazooka-style anti-tank warfare would be carried forward in the design of future rocket launchers and anti-tank guided missiles. The bazooka, with its simple design and ease of use, proved that even relatively low-tech solutions could be employed effectively to counter the most advanced technology. On the German side, the emotional toll of losing their tank superiority was not just about military failure, it was also about the crumbling myth of Nazi invincibility. The Tiger and Panther tanks had been used as symbols of German power, their might broadcast in Nazi propaganda as the embodiment of Aryan technological superiority. The destruction of these tanks at the hands of American infantrymen with bazookas undermined the narrative of German military invincibility that had been propagated for years. For both the German soldiers and civilians, the sight of their once proud war machines being destroyed by relatively simple Allied infantry weapons was a devastating blow to their morale. It was an undeniable sign that the war was nearing its end, and the Nazis' vision of a victorious future was collapsing under the weight of their own failures. For the civilian population of Germany, the loss of air superiority and tank dominance was the final stage in their country's downfall. With the Allies closing in from the west and Soviet forces advancing from the east, the Germans had no means of effectively resisting the encroaching invasion. The failure to protect their cities from the overwhelming firepower of the Allies, along with the destruction of their military capabilities, left Germany with no hope of holding out much longer. As the Allies continued to destroy the tanks that had once been the pride of Nazi Germany, they also destroyed the hope of victory. The Germans knew the war was lost, and the realization that their military had been defeated by a simple infantry weapon, like the bazooka, shattered the morale of both the soldiers on the front lines and the civilians who had once believed in the Nazi cause. The final months of the war saw the Allies sweeping through German territory, and by May 1945, the German surrender was imminent. The Allies' ability to neutralize German armor and cripple their ability to resist with the bazooka was a major factor in the swift collapse of the Third Reich. The use of bazookas by infantry squads would go on to become one of the most iconic aspects of the Allied victory. It was a small, portable weapon that had played a big role in ensuring the defeat of Nazi Germany, and it symbolized the adaptability and ingenuity that ultimately led to the Allied victory. The success of the bazooka in piercing the once impenetrable armor of the German tanks was a testament to the power of innovation in warfare. By adapting quickly to the technological needs of the battlefield, the Allies were able to level the playing field and disrupt Germany's greatest strength. This shift, in the final analysis, would come to define the modern approach to warfare. Not just overwhelming firepower, but the use of practical, innovative solutions to overcome even the most advanced technologies of the enemy. The simple yet profound impact of the U.S. bazooka on the course of World War II is a stark reminder of how innovation, no matter how small, can alter the course of history. The bazooka, a weapon that could be carried by a single infantryman, changed the dynamics of warfare on the Western Front and shifted the balance of power in tank battles. For the German military, it symbolized the end of their armored dominance, a force they had relied upon heavily to assert their military superiority. The shock of seeing their Tiger and Panther tanks, once symbols of invincibility, easily destroyed by a weapon they had underestimated was a psychological blow from which they would never recover. For the Allied forces, The bazooka represented a turning point in infantry tactics. What had once been a difficult challenge, taking on a German tank division with limited resources, was now a feasible task. It allowed infantry to engage German armor directly, providing a strategic advantage that leveled the playing field between heavily armored vehicles and the soldiers who had once been at their mercy. The bazooka was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of adaptability, a solution born out of necessity that became a cornerstone of Allied strategy in the final years of the war. The emotional toll on the German tank crews cannot be understated. The loss of their armored superiority represented more than just a tactical setback. It shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. For a country that had long touted the prowess of its military technology, this moment of vulnerability was a deeply humbling realization. The fear and disbelief that took root in the minds of German soldiers as they faced the Americans' newfound ability to destroy their tanks marked the collapse of their military might. The emotional impact of the bazooka's success also reached far beyond the battlefield. For the German civilians, the sight of their once proud military losing its most powerful asset, their tanks, was a sobering reminder that the war was nearing its end. The once invincible symbols of Nazi military prowess were being dismantled by relatively simple, portable weapons. This realization echoed across the German home front, as the war was no longer a battle for victory, but a desperate fight for survival. The aftermath of the bazooka's success was felt long after the war. The development of anti-tank weapons like the bazooka would go on to shape modern warfare. Its simplicity, portability, and effectiveness in breaking through heavily armored vehicles laid the groundwork for the development of more advanced infantry weapons that continue to evolve in modern military conflicts. The ability to counter the might of tanks with a weapon that could be used by regular soldiers is a concept that would remain central to modern military doctrine. Ultimately, the story of the bazooka is a reminder that victory in war is not solely determined by the size or power of your weapons, but by the ability to innovate, adapt, and find solutions where others see obstacles. The bazooka's role in the defeat of Nazi Germany proves that even the simplest weapons, when used effectively, can change the course of history. In the case of World War II, the weapon that shattered the German tank's dominance was not just a physical force. It was a symbol of the ingenuity, resilience, and adaptability of the Allied forces, who turned the tide of war and forged a path to victory, one infantryman at a time.